The very last thing that you would imagine would be for the Torah to say, Eile Toldos Yitzchak, who is the legacy of Yitzchak? Eisav. Eisav? Really? And yet, that's what the Midrash says. So we have to understand it, and in doing so, we'll analyze the difference between Yishmael and his relationship with Avraham Avinu, and Avraham Avinu's avodah and how he impacted the world, compared to Yitzchak and his unique relationship with Eisav, and how Yitzchak impacted the world, of course, with a great take-home lesson for us. Eisav Medrash, the Medrash tells us, Toldos Yitzchak, when the parasha begins by saying these are the descendants of Yitzchak, the vav means moisif al orishonim, that it's a continuation of what was mentioned previously. What was mentioned previously? Al masha kosav l'mayla menu b'nei Yishmael. What was mentioned previously at the end of Chayei Sarah was some of the descendants of Yishmael. Mi hayazeh, so now who are the descendants of Yitzchak? Ze Eisav u'banav shehaya b'nai shel Yitzchak. Says the Medrash, Eile Toldos Yitzchak, who are the descendants of Yitzchak? Eisav and Eisav and his children, because Eisav was Yitzchak's son. Kloimer, in other words, the Medrash is telling us Eile Toldos Yitzchak mechuvenes le'Eisav. That the Medrash is saying that these words, these are the descendants of Yitzchak, refers to Eisav. And at the same time, the Medrash tells us that Eisav was a Rasha like Yishmael was. And in fact, according to the Medrash, that's why the word Toldos is written without the second vav, to exclude Yaakov Avinu, because we shouldn't think chas v'sholem that Yaakov is one of these Rishoim. Now, v'tzarech lahavin, we really have to understand that. Now that we know that the Medrash associates Eile Toldos Yitzchak to Eisav, so the Medrash seems to be saying that when describing Yitzchak's descendants, the emphasis is placed on Eisav, not on Yaakov, and that is a shocking thought. Aleph, number one, practically. Where in the parasha are you going to see evidence to this? Where in the parasha do we seem to give credibility to Eisav over Yaakov? And more importantly, Beis V'ikar, the main question, how could you possibly suggest that when the Torah's Emes says the following are the descendants of Yitzchak, it really meant Eisav and not Yaakov? Really? So the high-level explanation is that Teichen Parshas Toldos Inyon of Avodas Yitzchak. That Toldos doesn't only tell us about Yitzchak's family, but more importantly about his avodah and the legacy of that avodah. So it tells us Toldosov, about his birth, Hanichoseli Gerar, that he moved to Gerar, Chafiris HaBe'eros, the fact that he dug wells, Uvir Choisov, and the blessings he gave at the end of the parsha, first to Yaakov and then to Eisav. Now, if this parsha looks to define and describe for us the unique avodah of Yitzchak, that means that there's something Yitzchak does which is different to Avraham Avinu, which was described in the preceding parshas. Where do we see that? You know where you're going to detect the unique avodah of Yitzchak? Is the main defining difference between Yitzchak's avodah and Avram's avodah plays out in how they related to their respective wayward sons. Yitzchak's relationship with Eisav, as we'll learn a little later in the Sikha, is completely different to Avraham Avinu's relationship with Yishmael. Because that's the main theme, that's why the parsha starts off by telling us Eile Toldos Yitzchak, which the Medrash identifies to mean that we're talking about Eisav. Because this parsha, which is called Toldos, to represent the theme of the parsha, where the Toldos is not just his physical progeny, but more importantly, his impact on the world. All of that will be determined and visible to us. Nikar alidei ve'ila Toldos Eisav. It will all become apparent to us by observing Yitzchak's relationship with Eisav, and so therefore that's what we have to analyze. What is unique about how Yitzchak relates to Eisav, and why is it different to Avraham and Yishmael? So let's first see, where do we notice the difference? Once you start to examine the differences between the Avraham-Yishmael relationship and the Yitzchak-Eisav relationship, you'll find what appears to be a contradictory theme. On one hand, Yishmael seems much closer spiritually to Avraham than Eisav is to Yitzchak. How do we know that? Because Yishmael did tshuva while Avraham Avinu was still alive, which implies why did he do tshuva while Avraham was alive? Must be Avraham Avinu's hashpah, influence on him. We have no evidence that Eisav ever did tshuva, and not only that, the Gemara Soita tells us, Rashi quotes it in our parsha, that Eisav was a troublemaker all the way, that when Yaakov Avinu passed away, Eisav tried to impede his burial in Maras Machpelah. So there's no tshuva, and he fights till the better end, literally till the better end. So on the one hand, Yishmael appears spiritually closer to Avram than Eisav is to Yitzchak. On the one hand, yet on the other hand, he has something fascinating. Avram, Yishmael, as we know very well, the expression that we use is that Avram, Yishmael left him completely. That implies a disconnect, a distance, a spiritual separation. And therefore, Yishmael is never considered Jewish. Which is why Yishmael could never inherit anything from Avram, even after he did tshuva. As the pasuk clearly says in Sarah Imenu's voice, that this guy who is the son of a maidservant is not going to inherit together with my son Yitzchak. So Yishmael is completely disconnected from Avram Avinu. Mashenken Eisav, by comparison, Eisav afal pishagam hu yotzav and nifrad mi Yitzchak. Yitzchak yotzav imenu Eisav, even though we use the same kind of expression, that Yitzchak, Eisav disconnected or left him, still, still according to many authorities, Eisav had the halachic status of a renegade Jew, of a heretic Jew, but Jew. And he deserved an inheritance, as the pasuk says, Yerusha le'Eisav nasati. I did give a Yerusha to Eisav. So you see this fascinating dichotomy. Yishmael appears closer to Avraham Avinu to the point that he does tshuva, which Eisav doesn't. Yet Yishmael is not considered Jewish at all, whereas Eisav is to a certain extent. Why is this? So perhaps he has a reason. The simplest reason why Yishmael is not considered Jewish and why Yishmael cannot inherit from Avram, who are Yosef and Amo, is because his pedigree is wrong. He's a maidservant's child. And the halacha is that it's automatic if somebody is born to a maidservant or to a slave, as the pasuk says, such a person cannot share inheritance like a full-fledged son. He's not a child. He's pogum. He's blemished. He's disconnected from the heritage. Mashenken Eisav ayubnashal Rivka, whereas the obvious difference is Eisav had a Jewish mother, Rivka. Surely that's the big difference. The problem is that when you go to the next story in history and you find that some of Yaakov Avinu's children were born to maidservants, and nevertheless all 12 of his children remained on the straight and narrow, dedicated to Hashem. Yaakov Avinu did not have a wayward son like either Avraham or Yitzchak had. So move on, that tells us that prior to the giving of the Torah and the full-fledged halachic status of Yichos, it was still possible that somebody could be born to a maidservant, like some of the Shvatim, and nevertheless be considered Jewish, and nevertheless be considered an heir. So, in that case, we're back to square one. What is the fundamental difference between Yishmael and Eisav? What did Eisav have that qualified him to be considered halachically Jewish, unlike Yishmael? In spite of the fact that logic tells us it should have been the other way around, because Yishmael's the fellow who did teshuvah and Eisav didn't. So that tells us immediately that tells us immediately we have to explain how and why, but somehow Yishmael's connection to Avram is not as deep as Esav's connection to Yitzchak. And the unique connection Eisav has to Yitzchak does not rely on him having to first do teshuvah in order to have that relationship. We need to understand it. So what is the connection between Yitzchak and Eisav that is so unique? We'll look at the Targum Yonasan ben Uziel about how Eisav was buried. We know the story. He wanted to prevent Yaakov being buried, and Chushim ben Don didn't understand what was going on and lobbed off his head, and the head rolled into the Maras Machpelah, and his head lands up in the cave. So where do we see the hint about the connection between Yitzchak and Eisav? The Targum ben Uziel tells us, Yonasan ben Uziel says, that the way it worked is that Eisav's head rolled and therefore was buried by the heels of Yitzchak. Wow, is that a strange concept? Halacha tells us you may not bury a person who is known to be a rasha next to a person who is known to be a tzaddik. You know what a big issue this is? Listen to the story. There was a time when the people of Moab were attacking, and so there was a funeral procession with a false Navi, and they tossed him into Elisha's grave. In the Tanakh tells us that in order to prevent this Rasha being side by side with Elisha, Hashem made a miracle. What miracle? The guy got up and walked out. Read the story in Melachim Beis, and you'll see over there that he got up and he walked out so as not to be buried next to a tzaddik. If that's the way it is, that a rasha and a tzaddik really should never be buried together, how did Hashem allow the circumstances to be such that Eisav's head should be buried by Yitzchak's heel? Especially when you consider Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel, when he says this description, Dafka in that conversation reminds us that Eisav is a rasha. How do they get together? Birbaz's explanation is fascinating. The fact that Eisav was a rasha is the reality of how Eisav lived in the physical form. As a human, physical human, he was totally off the rails. But when you look at Eisav from a higher perspective, so to speak, looking into his head, meaning when you look at Eisav in his pristine form, not in his physical form, especially when his head's been decapitated, so now it's disconnected from that physical form, ain't a rasha. Eisav is not a rasha. Can you believe that? Not only is Eisav not a rasha, Eisav has some meaningful connection to Yitzchak, which is why his disconnected, decapitated head belongs next to Yitzchak more than it belongs by his own body. Similar theme is the way we understand the Satan. When I analyze the spiritual root from where the Satan originates, then, as the Gemara says, Satan u'Penina l'shem shamayim niskavnu, that the Satan, like Penina, who was the co-wife of Chana, the mother of Shmuel HaNavi, who constantly agitated Chana, but it was l'shem shamayim. She wanted her to daven properly for a child. So Satan also agitates us, but it's l'shem shamayim to get us to have greater connection to Hashem. That's how it is in its shoresh. But what does the Satan look like in real life, in our experience? Absolute poison. Don't go near there. To the extent that the Satan found ways to be able to destroy the Beis HaMikdash, completely antithetical to what Hashem wants. So that's what happens. You have things that in their spiritual root are healthy, but they evolve into a state that is completely sick. Eisav's the same. When you look at Eisav at the moment of conception, when Yitzchak conceives a child, you look at where is the root that Eisav comes from, he's actually positive. It's just unfortunate that through the evolutionary process of this pristine spiritual being translating and deteriorating into the body of Eisav, the rasha, Shehura Gomer, complete Rasha, then even whatever spark of holiness he may have had from the perspective of his neshama cannot shine there. Like the expression goes, that the light of the Rasha extinguishes, it dims, goes out. So what do we see? Eisav has this incredible point of origin which is holy, and then of course he loses his way completely. This is the big difference between Eisav and Yishmael. Hein Yishmael, the Hein Eisav, Toldos Avraham and Yitzchak. The fact is that both Yishmael and Eisav are both descendants of great people, Avraham and Yitzchak respectively. No matter how far they may go, somewhere inside of them, the potential and the power of their respective fathers remains. It cannot be undone. Especially when you consider that we're talking over here about tzaddikim who are similar to their creator. And if they build something like Moshe Rabbeinu builds the Mishkan, and now it's Moshe Nitzchim, the Mishkan is eternal. So, how much more so must their input into their descendants be eternal? In other words, what are we saying? That means Yishmael will always have a spark of Avram's holy input, and Eisav will always have a spark of Yitzchak's holy input. Avol, but Yishmael's not living with Avram, he's living out there, Pere Adam, doing whatever, Yodeh Bakol, attacking people in the fields. Eisav is ish sadeh, ish yedeh tzeit, he's behaving, they're far away from the source. So whatever impact their respective fathers have on them, it's their impact as translated into their, so to speak, disconnected realities. What does that mean? So we have to understand Avraham and Yitzchak and how they operate in order to understand how their impact will continue to influence or not influence their children. So what's going to make Eisav and Yishmael look different is that there's different types of input from their respective fathers into their lives. The way Avraham Avinu continuously impacted Yishmael is to the point that he eventually did tshuva. But on the other hand, that Yishmael did tshuva without actually fundamentally changing, and he still remains Yishmael ben Ha'ama. He does tshuva, but he still doesn't have a meaningful connection to his own father. As opposed to Eisav. You look at Eisav, the way Eisav presents in a human form, he is far worse than Yishmael. That's why he never does tshuva, because he's too far gone. And nevertheless, Mikol Mokim, despite that mitzad reishei kefishu nifrenu menutak migufay, when you still analyze the root source that it comes from, the so-called head that has been disconnected from the body, Yitzchak, he still has a connection at least to Yitzchak's lowest level, his heel. Why is this? To understand this, we're going to observe a concept in halacha where there are two possible perspectives of how something plays out, a particular halacha, the halacha of shlichus, and based on that we'll understand this principle. We'll understand the connection that Yishmael has to Avraham and the connection Eisav has to Yitzchak. We'll understand it based on the two possible ways in which we can understand how shlichus operates. Okay, so shlichus is, I appoint you, please be my proxy, go do X and Y for me. Now what has happened at this point in time? So Hezberech, I'll do one possibility is, you are you, I am I, we are not the same person. But halacha allows me the possibility to appoint you as my proxy. Therefore, the Torah now allows you to do an action which will be attributed to me. You are you, I am I. Your action is attributed to me halachically. That's possibility one. Another possibility. If I appoint you as my agent, you become me. In that action, in that period of time, you are me. So naturally, obviously, whatever you do is attributed to me. So we're going to pick up a similar kind of distinction between Yishmael and Eisav, which has to do with a different kind of avodah of Avraham and Yitzchak. There are obviously various differences between how they served Hashem. We're going to focus on one of them. A pretty obvious one, by the way. One of the big differences between how Avraham and Yitzchak respectively behaved. Avraham Avinu's job was milemaila, bring down holiness to become noticed and perceived in this world. Whereas Yitzchak did the almost exact opposite. His avodah is lift the world, to refine the world so that you could elevate it in a direction towards Hashem. Okay, so Avraham Avinu brings Hashem into the world, and Yitzchak tries to lift the world to meet Hashem. You can actually see this very clearly in how they behaved. Avraham Avinu was on a mission to create awareness of Hashem in the minds of the simplest, most distant people. Even the Arabs of the time who bowed to the dust of their own feet, which shows you a tremendous sense of lowliness. Avraham Avinu wanted to ensure that even they would become aware of Hashem's greatness. But Yitzchak, like we see in this week's parasha, his big thing was digging wells. What's digging wells? To remove the stone, the sand, the rocks, the trees, whatever's in the way of the water that is already naturally beneath the surface, and to bring it to the top. Which translates spiritually into removing the earthiness, the materialism of the created reality. Remove all the schmutz, so as to expose the holy, godly spark that lives at the core of every single thing. Right? So you dig and dig and dig, and the water comes flowing to the surface. Same thing, you dig and dig and dig, and the holiness flows to the surface. So Avraham Avinu brings consciousness of Hashem to the world, and Yitzchak digs in the world till it discovers its own connection. So each one of their approaches has an advantage that the other one lacks. If you introduce godliness from on high into the world, you inject godliness into the world. So what's the advantage? The advantage is you got Hashem entering the world, it's, so to speak, on his terms. The disadvantage is nothing in the lower world actually changes. Let's look at our examples. When you have an Arab who bows down to the dust of his feet, suddenly saying, "Oh, I acknowledge God," it's not his personal work that he did. It's not something he could personally relate to. It's Avraham Avinu's cheerleading. Avraham Avinu led them in what they should say. He coaxed this announcement out of them. Nu, acknowledge Hashem. Okay, how do we do it? This is what you got to say. And therefore, even when the Arab community gets up and makes this big announcement, Hashem hu Elokim, it's Avraham Avinu's achievement, not theirs. They haven't owned it yet. So therefore, even after Avraham is successful and everybody acknowledges Hashem, they hadn't been upgraded as people. They were still stuck in their lowly reality. They were the same people, the same Arabs they were before. So Avraham Avinu superimposes holiness onto the world, but the world does not fundamentally change. Whereas what Yitzchak achieves, which is lifting from the bottom up, his impact is that whatever shift happens, whatever awareness and consciousness of Hashem happens, is not because it was fed to us, it's because we shifted. Hu atzmoi mishtane umisroimein v'alidei mekabel shaychus elikus. Yitzchak's pu'ula is that me, the lowly human, I shift, I lift, I move myself, and therefore I'm in a position to receive from Hashem. It's like digging a well. Digging a well is not to create a pool and then import water to pour into the pool, superimpose fresh water from elsewhere. Digging the well is to show you thought that this was just dirt, but there's actually water beneath, and I'll find you that water. So Avraham Avinu imports Mayim Chaim. Yitzchak shows you that you have Mayim Chaim inside of yourself. Yet on the other hand, what we've just described illustrates why it's better to go Yitzchak's route. Why? Because when you go Yitzchak's route, there's real movement, there's real shift, there's real change, there's real growth. But there's still an advantage to Avram's method. Why? The advantage is that the lower element doesn't have to change before it can receive godliness. It stays where it is, and the godliness reaches all the way to that lowly place. Even though it's very lowly, it's still now absorbing elikus. Like Avraham Avinu did. He says, you don't have to change, you don't have to convert. You could be who you are and still acknowledge Hashem. Whereas if you're taking Yitzchak's approach and you're trying to lift the world from the bottom up, and you need people to move and you need the world to shift. In Yitzchak's method, the only way you become open and susceptible to receive godliness is once you change. But as long as you're still in your lowly place, sorry, I cannot help you. You have to shift. So, the Maila of Yitzchak is that you shift. The Maila of Avraham is that we can bring Elikus all the way to where you are. Home delivery. And that explains the two different paths of Avraham and Yitzchak and how they served Hashem. Avraham yotzem Eretz Yisrael v'yorad leMitzrayim leMitzorim ugvurim dechutz la'aretz v'hir gamas chutz la'aretz. Avraham Avinu traveled to places that were outside of Eretz Yisrael and even antithetical to Eretz Yisrael, like Egypt, and he brought light to those places. Whereas Yitzchak was never allowed to leave. To leave Eretz Yisrael, as we'll learn in next week's Sikha. Which means to say that Yitzchak can only work in an environment that is already somewhat elevated. But he can't reach a place that is so lonely, so disconnected, so unspiritual, like the outside of it, the lands outside of Eretz Yisrael. Because as far as he is concerned, in his experience, the outside world has no relationship or no potential relationship with Kedusha. So now you see it clearly. Avraham Avinu's avodah is bring the Elikus into the world, even into the lowest part of the world. Yitzchak's avodah is lift the world, even if that means that certain parts of the world are never going to be touched by the Elikus because they have to first be lifted. Those are the two approaches. And that will speak directly to how Yishmael and Eisav land up being so different. Chelek ze ben avodas Avraham and avodas Yitzchak hu gam asiv lechilek sheben Toldos Yishmael ve'Eisav, because of the two different approaches and avodas. That's why you have two different, totally different kinds of children. Mitzad inyonu shel Avraham hamshacham ma'ile lemato nimtza shegam kasher Toldos ve'im bebechinas mata beno amo. Because Avraham Avinu's whole approach is bring Elikus into the lowest of the low. So Yishmael is still the lowest of the low. He's still a maidservant. Shaf Yotzer Tarbus Roy is mixing in the wrong company. Avraham Avinu can touch Yishmael even in such a derelict spiritual place, and he can get into tshuva. And that's why the very fact that Avraham Avinu in the first place married a maidservant, that doesn't contradict his avodah ve'adrabah. To the contrary, zehu achidesh hamiyuchot shel avodah. That actually speaks the language of Avraham Avinu's avodah. Sheyeshno metzius shel mata. There is such a person who is so lowly, like a maidservant. And I am able to bring kedusha to her and through her. Through her to her descendants, his descendants. Avraham Avinu is not naive. He knows how lowly Yishmael is. But Avraham Avinu also knows that the nature of his avodah is to work with the lowly person and daven on their behalf. Even Yishmael, Yishmael, as Yishmael, should be able to live, so to speak, before you. But because Avraham Avinu's approach is you import the water, you keep the flow, you superimpose the godliness on the reality of the lowly part of the world, so it only lasts as long as Avraham is dynamic. And as it says at the end of the parasha, that after Avraham Avinu passed away, Yishmael fell. Meaning to say he doesn't have that spiritual energy pumping into him, so he can't sustain himself. Therefore, as a result of that, Yishmael never rises. He's never upgraded, and certainly not to the level of Avraham Avinu. If you look at Yishmael objectively, he's left the room. He's moved on. Which is why he can never inherit from Avraham Avinu, because he's moved on. He has no connection. Only when he was plugged in, only when Avraham Avinu was pumping energy into him did he have a prospect of teshuvah. Once that's over, he's nobody. Particularly when you consider that there's an explanation in halacha that the person who is the heir to something completely replaces the one that he inherits from. That could never happen with Yishmael and Avraham because they just don't have that connection. But for Yitzchak, that would never have been sufficient. Okay, so Yishmael is going to be blasted with energy. Yitzchak says, I need Yishmael to change. Or in his case, Eisav, because that's the one he's influencing. So not only does Yitzchak have a direct influence on Eisav, but because Eisav is his son, Eisav inherits some of his energy, the energy to what? To lift the lowly world. That's why Yitzchak, when he and Rivka battled infertility, never entered his mind to marry a maidservant, because then that would produce an individual who would be a child of a maidservant, who would be at such a lowly level. Yitzchak doesn't deal with lowly levels. You've got to lift your game if you want to have anything to do with Yitzchak. And that's why Eisav, in spite of all of his toxic behavior, is still considered Jewish, albeit a Jewish renegade, and theoretically could be an heir. But that's not the whole of Eisav. What part of Eisav is connected? The highest part of Eisav, the so-called head, and it's the decapitated head, because that represents the pristine point of origin of Eisav as opposed to the real life Eisav. But when Eisav's head remains connected to his body, to his physical lowly reality, meaning when he's down on earth, then he's as far as you could possibly go. He doesn't even know how to begin to do tshuva, and he can't. Which is why in Chassidus we're told that the klippa represented by Eisav is a worse klippa than that represented by Yishmael. Parenthetically, we need to know that Avraham and Yitzchak are obviously very diverse kinds of avodah, each of which laid the groundwork and prepared for Yaakov Avinu to come along. That he had both elements to him. He had the advantage of Avraham and the advantage of Yitzchak. How so? Because look, Yaakov Yaakov did things like Avraham Avinu. He went out of Eretz Yisrael and he had an impact on Eretz Yisrael. He went into the lowly space as Yitzchak never did. But unlike Avraham Avinu, when Yaakov was out there in the field, he didn't just simply illuminate the place with great inspiration. But there he built up a family. He took people from that environment and used them to build up a family that would become this beautiful mitos shlema 12 shvatim. That also explains why, unlike Yitzchak, Yaakov could marry maidservants. Because Yaakov Avinu has this amazing capacity to be able to take even the children of Shvatim, which Avraham could only inspire, and Yitzchak could never touch, and Yaakov could take them and elevate them to become not just part of the family, but Shiftei Ka, the ultimate Shvatim that represent what Jewish people are supposed to be. Based on this, Yuvan Gamatam Shechele Godmi Parshas Toldos, the Haina Eisav Canal, Apia Medrash. We can now understand why a big chunk of this parsha, which, as we've already discussed in this medrash, is themed around Eisav. Big chunk of the parsha is about how Yitzchak prepared to give the brachas in his mind to Eisav, and how the brachas came out in practice. Guess what? It's the same theme. Here too, you see the expression of Yitzchak's unique avodah, and specifically vis-a-vis Eisav. One of the most perplexing things you have to wonder is, why did Yitzchak want to bless Eisav knowing who he was? It's because he had the capacity with his mouth not to fool his father, but to actually say, so to speak, the right things. There's a part of him that speaks the right language. Which means that somewhere inside Eisav, at a very high, deep level, there are these incredible sparks of holiness, some of which came out in practice. Some very great personalities who are descendants of Eisav. Seeing as we know that Yitzchak's primary avodah is to dig wells, which we've now explained means to expose their innate holiness within every part of the world, as this parasha tells us. Because his whole job is to mine the world for its resources, therefore, what Yitzchak wanted to achieve was to give these brachas to Eisav, and through that, to be able to mine and dig and extract the holy, healthy waters that live even inside Eisav. If you're looking at Eisav through Yitzchak's eyes, you see the Eisav who deserves this. But the reality of Eisav in real life is he's too far gone, and he does not deserve these brachas. And that's why the practical way that the story played out was dafka that Yaakov should get the brachas, because actually only Yaakov is the one who could turn Eisav around. Now that's Eisav we're talking about. What a simple and powerful lesson for us. If Eisav, who was a complete Rasha and lived before the Torah, because the Torah obviously rescues you to a certain extent, can you imagine if Eisav could still have the title Yisrael associated with him? Yes, of course, with the subtitle Mumar, that he's a heretic and a renegade, but still Yisrael. And if Yitzchak Avinu still tried to dig deeply enough to expose to Eisav his true essence, how much more so when we deal with Jewish people today after the giving of the Torah? After Hashem made the proclamation at Har Sinai, Anoichi, I am Elokecha, your koyach, your capacity, your ability, completely accessible to you. No matter who you are, no matter your level. And especially when you consider that those Jews who are not as they should be, there's no question about it, that they are exponentially better off than Eisav was. The worst, so to speak, Jew today is far better than Eisav was. Especially when you consider that 99% of those people who are, so to speak, off the path are there because they don't know any better. If Yitzchak was willing to put in so much effort, even take chances for Eisav, how much more so do we have to sacrifice and dedicate ourselves to bring every Jew back and close to Torah? No matter how far they may appear to be, our job is to dig and dig as deeply as we can until such time that we find the living waters that are guaranteed to be at the core of every single Jewish person. You just have to be careful, of course, when you reach out to people with all of the excitement and passion. You've got to follow what the Mishnah tells us in Pirkei Avos, that like Aaron HaKohen, you have to love every person and bring them close to the Torah, which means you have to bring the so-called creatures towards the Torah, and never chas v'sholem compromise the Torah, so being more palatable in your estimation for the people. We dare not compromise anything of Torah mitzvahs. Even if you imagine that that's somehow going to bring them closer, forget about it. We don't compromise. Torah is eternal. Never changes, never diminishes, never increases. And therefore it's out of the question. On the one hand, you have to go with everything you've got to help a Jew discover the spark within themselves. But you're never allowed to compromise one iota of Torah in order to, in your belief, achieve that. Rashi alludes to this at the beginning of the parsha when he says, Ve'ele Toldos. What does it mean? Ve'ele Toldos, Yaakov and Eisav, hu amurim beparsha. Yaakov and Eisav as listed in the parsha, meaning, Mihu ha-Eisav she'inoi Toldos Yitzchak. What's Rashi telling us? Which Eisav can be attributed to Yitzchak's legacy and dynasty? Eisav ha'amur beparsha b'Torah. Eisav as he is in his pristine form, described and identified by Torah. Which means when Yaakov, using the tools and guidance of Torah, is successful in elevating Eisav. So how do you do this? The answer, the advice is, when you look at another person, look at their source, look at their head, look at the highest element of who they are. That way you won't notice their lowly spiritual state. All you will identify with is their deep internal greatness. Which would be the reason why this Yid, who you think is so whatever, is completely dedicated to doing Torah. You just got to dig a little bit more. And when you recognize that, you'll do everything in your power to draw that Yid close to Torah. And Hashem, through that, bring us all together and bring Mashiach now.